Hey flock and friends, welcome to episode 2 of the Write That Crochet Pattern podcast. On today's episode, I'm going to share with you all the nitty gritty of crochet industry standards. I'm going to totally nerd out, and I'm hoping not to bore you guys to death because I could totally get so technical in explaining things, but I'm going to do my best not to make it boring. Okay, so we're going to get into all the nitty-gritty good stuff about industry standards, and I'm also going to share why independent designers should use industry standards when writing their own crochet patterns. For those of you who don't know me yet, my name is Cherie Mellick. I am the crochet tech editor behind Sweetbird Crochet. As a crochet tech editor, I specialize in helping designers publish patterns that are not only accurate, but they're also clear, polished, and easy to follow. My mission is to empower crochet designers through education and mentorship so they can design and write patterns with excellence. Thank you for joining me for today's episode. Go ahead, you know the drill. Grab your latest project, grab your favorite drink, and listen in as you crochet. Before we discuss the different aspects of industry standards in crochet, I think it's a good idea to explain industry standards just in general terms. This is going to give us a solid foundation for better understanding our own industry's specifics. So industry standards are basically a set of guidelines or a framework that help determine how products or processes or even services should be created and delivered. So these standards, no matter what industry you're in, are going to have several purposes. One purpose of these standards is to keep everything consistent throughout the entire industry. So when everyone in the industry sticks to a framework or the standards that are established, then everything is just predictable and it all works well together. And then another purpose is to maintain a standard of quality assurance. So standards set a bar for the quality of the products, the quality of the services, and even the quality of processes. And this is going to help companies keep things at their very best to meet the customer's expectations. Almost every industry you can think of has some form of standards. So for example, those who manufacture and sell goods, they rely on industry standards to ensure quality and safety and compliance. A good example would be car manufacturers. Government agencies also have industry standards that they refer to when they're developing legislation, like the Consumer Product Safety Commission or even the Environmental Protection Agency. Regulated entities also have industry standards like medical device manufacturers. They have to adhere to the standards that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, set forth. Then there's trade associations, and these trade associations represent specific industries that collaborate to develop and promote specific standards. The crochet industry has a trade association. Did you know that? A lot of crocheters have no idea that we have a trade association. So our trade association is the Craft Yarn Council. So this Craft Yarn Council was incorporated in 1981 as a nonprofit organization. So its mission was to represent manufacturers and distributors of yarn and notions and tools used in the fiber crafts. And then they also represent like various magazine publishers and book publishers, and then also different industry consultants. So the Craft Yarn Council saw a need in the fiber community to put together standards that everyone could follow so there would be uniformity across the industry. They've established things like yarn guidelines, labels, different symbols, needle and hook labels, and then standards for patterns. Pretty interesting stuff, isn't it? The council collaborates with various industry players, including AXA acrylic fibers, there's Boy Needles and Crafts, Clover Needle Craft, Craftsy, Knit Picks, Knitter's Pride, Lion Brand Yarns, Love Crafts, Prime Publishing, Prim Consumer USA, Red Heart yarns, and yarn inspirations. And that's all the ones that I know about. So anytime you go into a big box store like Michael's or Hobby Lobby or Joann, you're going to find that all the yarn labels are consistent from one store to the next. They all have the same information on the labels. And the same goes for like the sizing and the labeling of crochet hooks and knitting needles. Before I get into all the nitty gritty of crochet industry standards, I want to share with you why it's important for you as an independent crochet designer to adhere to these standards when you're writing your crochet patterns. So I want to preface everything I'm about to say. I want to preface it with this. You are not obligated to use industry standards. So these standards were established to bring consistency and uniformity across the various manufacturers, magazines, book publishers, and then the different distributors. When these standards were established, publishing patterns independent from a magazine or a book or a newspaper really was unheard of. But now, with the age of the World Wide Web, we see so many patterns published outside of what used to be industry norms. As an independent designer, meaning you do not work for or with these companies or platforms, you don't need to follow these standards. However, it really is in your best interest to do so. And I'm going to tell you why. These standards are already widely accepted and recognized by all crocheters. So these standards have already been established and they're recognized throughout the world, really. And by using industry standards when writing your patterns, you just make your patterns easier to understand and you ensure consistency in your pattern. So this familiarity allows crocheters to work on your design without feeling confused since they're already accustomed to the different terms and abbreviations and all that used in your pattern. And then when you follow these standards, you inevitably make your work accessible to more people. This means that no matter what a person's location, whether they are in the UK, even though they use different terms, they could still understand. Or if the person is in Australia, they'll be able to follow your pattern. And this one right here is a very big one for me. When you write your patterns in line with these standards, you elevate your work to a level of professionalism that reflects your commitment and your passion for the design that you created. So this professionalism, it's going to foster trust with your readers. And when you build that trust, your readers are going to keep coming back to buy more patterns. As someone who designs and tech edits crochet patterns, I truly believe that if you want to be taken seriously as a designer, your patterns, they need to be written as professionally as possible. That's why it's really, really important to write them according to industry standards. And you guys know, always get them professionally tech edited. I knew coming into today's podcast that I was probably going to have to break this topic up into two different episodes because there's just so much information to cover. And honestly, I do not want to overwhelm you with all this information. I tend to get a bit carried away when I'm discussing subjects that I'm really passionate about. So on the next episode, we're going to cover the second half of the standards. Okay, so the first standard we're going to nerd out about is yarn. That's the fun one. If you're at a place where you can pause this podcast, go ahead and do so and grab the closest skein of yarn next to you. Okay, if you look at the back of the yarn label, everything you see should be labeled according to industry standards. So these standards are guidelines and metrics that explain the different qualities and characteristics of the yarn. So first, let's look for the fiber content. The label I'm looking at says 58% acrylic and 42% nylon. So every yarn label should specify the materials used in the yarn in the percent that they're used. So different material might drape in different ways. So knowing the fiber content is really important. Next, look for the yarn weight. The label I'm looking at is a bulky or size 5. We're going to discuss yarn weights in detail in just a second, but basically these labels indicate the thickness of the yarn, which affects the finished fabric's appearance as well as the texture. Now look for the gauge. It's usually listed as a square with 1 square for knitting gauge and 1 square for crochet. So the standard gauge is 4 inches 10 centimeters square, and that's for crochet and knitting. So we're going to talk about gauge in detail in the next episode, but if you look at each square, you're going to see that there's the stitch gauge and the row gauge listed. The stitch gauge is on the bottom of the square and the row gauge is on the side. And in the middle of the square is the recommended hook or needle for that yarn weight. Now, the key word here is recommended hook or needle size. It does not mean that you have to use that size hook or needle. It just means that in order to achieve the gauge that's listed on the label, it's recommended to use that particular size hook or needle. Then look for the yarn's net weight. It should list ounces, grams, yards, and meters. So this information is really helpful for determining whether you have enough yarn for a project. And then last but not least, look for the care instructions. This provides information on how to wash and care for the finished item. So why do yarn standards matter? Well, for one, consistency across different brands. So if every company uses industry standards when they're developing their yarn brands, then it just makes it easier for designers and makers to switch between one brand and the next. So for example, a worsted weight yarn should have a consistent thickness no matter what brand you buy. Then there's the ease of substitution. So with yarn standards, crocheters and knitters can easily swap out yarns without too much guesswork. So for example, if a pattern calls for a worsted weight yarn, knowing the general thickness and gauge range for that weight makes it so much easier to find a substitution that's going to behave in a similar way, even if it's from a different brand or even a different fiber content. And then there is the communication in patterns. So when designers use standards when listing the yarn that they use for their patterns, readers can quickly understand what type of yarn is needed for the design. And this avoids any misunderstanding about the thickness, about the texture, and even the weight. And this is going to help your reader, especially beginners, feel more confident when they're making their yarn choices. You might be wondering how exactly you should be listing yarn in your crochet patterns if you want to adhere to the standards. On my blog, I have actually listed 3 examples that you can use in your crochet patterns. Okay, let's talk about the different yarn weight categories. So yarn weights are categorized into several types, from lace to super bulky. And I would highly recommend that you familiarize yourself with those categories so that you can choose the right yarn for the projects that you design. I'm going to go through all the different categories and kind of explain the standard name and the standard weight and also the standard hook size that they recommend using. So the first one is lace. It's also known as fingering weight. It's a size 0 weight. And the recommended hook size ranges anywhere from 1.6 to 1.4 millimeter steel hooks. Then there's superfine. This is a size 1 weight, and it's also called a sock, a fingering, or a baby. So the recommended hook size is 2.25 to 3.5 millimeter. Next is a size 2, which is a fine weight, also known as a sport or baby weight. But the recommended hook size for a fine weight is 3.5 to 4.5 millimeter. And then next, my favorite yarn weight category is DK or light worsted, also known as light. And this is a size 3 yarn. And the recommended hook size is 4.5 to 5.5 millimeter. My next most favorite yarn weight is a size 4, which is a medium, also known as a worsted, Afghan, or Aran weight yarn. And the recommended hook size is 5.5 to 6.5 millimeter. And I will say this right now, I normally use a 3.5 when I'm working with a worsted weight yarn. I go down really, really small. And it's normally because I'm working an amigurumi pattern and I want my stitches super tight. Okay, the next category is a bulky. A bulky weight is also known as a chunky, a craft, or a rug weight. And it's a size 5, and the recommended hook size is a 6.5 to 9 millimeter crochet hook. And then there's the super bulky, also known as super bulky or roving weight. And it's a size 6 yarn. And the recommended hook size is anywhere from 9 to 15 millimeter. Okay, now let's talk about standard crochet hook sizes. Okay, again, if you have a moment, pause this podcast, grab your closest crochet hook if it's not already in your hand. Did you notice that on your crochet hook, it lists a letter and the millimeter size? Do you want to know why that is? I am about to go down a rabbit trail and nerd out a little bit. I'm sure you already know that the majority of the world uses the metric system. So the metric system uses kilometers, centimeters, millimeters, and so forth. That's how they measure distance, length, weight, and whatnot. But the United States, it doesn't use that system. So at one point, they had tried to incorporate the metric system, and it was through the 1975 Metric Conversion Act. And it was a law that intended to encourage the country to use the metric system. And the federal government, it had tested this on Federal State Highway I-19 that's located in southern Arizona. So basically the test failed. And I-19 was the only interstate to be measured in kilometers. So basically, the United States doesn't use the metric system because of everyone being so confused by it. And because of this confusion, many US industries, including the crochet industry, had to incorporate some form of lettering instead of solely using millimeters as the measurement. So for example, when you look at your crochet hook, I'm looking at my size H8 5 millimeter hook. So the H is the letter that represents 5 millimeters. And the number 8 actually corresponds to the US size range for knitting needles. And if you look at all the different sizes of crochet hooks, you're going to notice that many of them have the number corresponding to the size range for the knitting needles. That really blew my mind when I discovered that. Okay, so when you are listing your hook size in your crochet pattern, I would encourage you to always include both sizing options. So there's two ways that I would recommend listing it. You can simply list H dash 8 and then have 5 millimeters in the parentheses, or you can get a little bit more in depth and you can list it by saying US size H dash 8, 5 millimeter in parentheses, crochet hook, comma, or size needed to obtain gauge. Some people will list just the millimeters, which is fine, but I always recommend giving as much information as possible so there's no confusion whatsoever. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about in today's episode is standard abbreviations. So these abbreviations are basically shorthand terms used to represent different stitches or techniques. Could you imagine how long a crochet pattern would be if we didn't use any abbreviations at all? I mean, it would be ridiculously long. So these shorthand terms were developed as a practical solution to enhance the readability of crochet patterns. Like I said before, in the past, crochet patterns were mainly published in magazines, books, and newspapers, which there's only a limited amount of space that they could use in their publication for such things as a crochet pattern. So the publishers they were faced with that challenge of trying to condense such complex instructions into a limited format without sacrificing any type of clarity or accuracy. So to address this, they created standardized abbreviations and symbols that could effectively communicate all the essential information while conserving the space in their publications. And this huge innovation not only simplified the instructions for crafters, but it also made it easier to follow patterns, regardless of the reader's skill level. And as crochet became more popular, these standard abbreviations really began to spread globally. And this allowed crocheters from different backgrounds to understand and share patterns more easily. Who would have thought you were going to get on this podcast and get a little history lesson today? Okay, so using standard abbreviations in your patterns is super important for a few reasons, with clarity being the biggest one. So when you stick to well-known abbreviations, it makes it way easier for anyone to follow along. Picture a beginner picking up your pattern. And if they see terms that are familiar, they're going to feel a whole lot more confident about diving into your project. This is going to create a really good experience for them, and it's going to make them want to come back for more of your patterns in the future. And using standard abbreviations really brings just an added touch of professionalism to your work. And y'all know I'm all about patterns being professional. When your pattern sticks to a familiar norms or standards, it shows that you know your stuff and that you're dedicated to writing really good patterns. And this not only builds trust with your audience, but it also is going to boost your reputation as a designer. I had heard a well-known crochet designer share one time on her Instagram. She was doing a reel on how to write crochet patterns. She basically told her audience that they should write their patterns like as if they're talking. And then she also told them that they don't have to have it tech edited. She's got a huge following on social media, and I'm not going to lie, her reel honestly ruffled my feathers. Don't worry, I didn't make a comment on her reel or anything like that, but it did really make me kind of sad because, for one, she blatantly disregarded my profession as a tech editor, and she was using her public platform to share information or misinformation. What she was sharing was not helpful, and it definitely was not accurate whatsoever. Listen, you do not have to remind me of what I said at the beginning of the podcast about independent crochet designers not having to follow industry standards. While they don't have to follow the standards when writing their patterns, there is that level of professionalism that you really need to consider if you want to sell your patterns and turn this into a business or a side hustle. People are unlikely to purchase your patterns if they're complicated, if they're hard to read, or difficult to understand. And this is going to bring me to my final point about crochet abbreviations. Please, 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 whatever you do not make up your own abbreviations. When you do, it can be so confusing and frustrating for your readers. Your reader will have to constantly refer back to your abbreviation list to understand what you mean by whatever made up abbreviations you use. If you want to write really great patterns, I really encourage you to become familiar with these standards. I do have a free crochet abbreviation resource on my blog, and you can find it in the transcript of this podcast. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode. We'll wrap up our conversation on crochet industry standards in the next episode. If you're new here, take a minute to subscribe, leave a review or a rating. I would love to hear from you. I enjoy sharing the knowledge that I've gained over the years about designing and writing crochet patterns with you. Until next time, write that crochet pattern.